Usually when we talk about a diagnostic assessment, there's this expectation of precision.
Right, like it's highly mechanical.
Exactly. I mean, you break your arm, the X-ray reveals this jagged white line,
Yeah.
and the doctor just points at it and says, there's the problem, here's the exact intervention.
It's binary. It's clean. And, the human brain really craves that level of visible categorical certainty.
But the moment you step into the realm of macroeconomics, or like long-term societal evolution, that X-ray machine just completely shatters.
Oh, completely. You're suddenly navigating a landscape that is, well, it's incredibly complex, multi-layered, and frankly, full of contradictory indicators.
Which brings us to today. Welcome to today's deep dive. We've got an incredibly expansive journey mapped out for you.
Yeah, it's a massive one.
Today, we're essentially taking on the role of macro physicians and our patient, the entirety of the Eurozone.
That's a huge patient.
Right. We are analyzing this comprehensive, just massive 15-page data presentation. It's built on World Bank aggregates for the European Economic and Monetary Union.
The EMU.
Exactly. We basically have over 60 years of their collective medical charts. We're tracking everything from their metabolic wealth generation to their neurological human capital, all the way down to their respiratory carbon emissions.
I love that analogy.
And, well, spoiler alert for you listening, this organism is aging rapidly. But somehow it has completely re-engineered its own survival mechanisms to become smarter and more efficient than ever before.
The sheer scope of the data set we're examining today is wild. I mean, spanning from 1960 all the way to 2023, that's what makes this analysis so exceptionally rare.
Because we usually don't zoom out that far.
Never. In modern financial analysis, we are so heavily conditioned to just, react to the immediate noise.
Like the quarterly earnings call.
Exactly. We obsess over quarterly earnings, the monthly inflation ticks, the reactionary central bank rate hikes. But a data set spanning over 6 decades, it forces us to step back.
We aren't looking at the weather anymore.
No, we're looking at the tectonic plates of a massive economic block, slowly shifting, colliding, and reshaping the continent's foundation.
And the overarching narrative synthesized from these World Bank aggregates, it lays out this fascinating 4-part evolutionary arc.
Right, the executive summary basically maps the whole journey.
Yeah. We see an initial era of raw, volume-driven growth, but then that abruptly forces a structural transformation in human capital.
Because they couldn't just keep growing by adding more bodies.
Exactly. Then the organism hits these severe environmental and thermodynamic constraints. And finally, it arrives at the current era, staring down a mathematically intimidating demographic bottleneck.
We're looking at a living, breathing economic ecosystem, one that has constantly rewritten its own operational code to survive like massive global shocks.
That concept of rewriting operational code is the perfect lens for this deep dive. I mean, the institutions, the labor markets, the energy grids within the Eurozone, they've demonstrated a masterclass in structural adaptation.
They didn't just weather the global transformations of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. They fundamentally altered their internal mechanics to stay relevant.
Right. But to really understand that adaptation, we can't start by looking at their aging population or, their green energy transition.
No, you have to start with the baseline.
You have to start by examining the core engine. Like, how is this organism actually generating its lifeblood? How much true wealth is it creating?
And when you look at the macroeconomic indicators, the trajectory of their adjusted net national income is just staggering.
It really is. We are talking about an explosion from roughly $4.01 trillion in the 1970s up to $10.21 trillion by 2021.
And that's measured in constant 2015 US dollars, so it accounts for inflation.
Right. And on a per capita basis, it's this relentless staircase upwards, from under $10,000 in 1960 to well over $20,000 by 2023.
But, and this is crucial, the World Bank data is very deliberate here. They focus on adjusted net national income rather than just resting on raw GDP figures.
Yeah, let's unpack that. Why is relying solely on gross domestic product over a 60-year horizon analytically dangerous?
Well, because GDP is essentially just a measure of sheer velocity. It measures the aggregate of goods and services produced, the absolute friction of the economy.
Like how fast the engine is spinning.
Exactly. But adjusted net national income is a far more sophisticated metric. It strips away the illusion of perpetual growth by factoring in the depreciation of physical capital and the depletion of natural resources.
Okay, give me an example of how that looks in the real world.
Sure. So If you clear-cut an ancient forest to build disposable furniture, your GDP spikes dramatically in that fiscal quarter.
Because you produced a lot of furniture.
Right. But your adjusted net income accounts for the reality that, well, the forest is gone. You can no longer leverage it for future wealth generation.
Ah, okay. So it's the difference between looking at a company's gross revenue versus its actual free cash flow after like capital expenditures and environmental liabilities.
Precisely. It's a much truer measure of sustainable wealth.
That distinction is vital for you listening. It's like looking at a corporate balance sheet where the top-line revenue looks phenomenal. But once you account for the factories rusting out and maybe pending lawsuits for environmental dumping.
The actual retained wealth is significantly lower.
Exactly. And the data indicates that the Eurozone's adjusted net savings hover around a relatively healthy 10% of their gross national income.
Which is solid.
It is.
Yeah.
But when you look at the internal math of that 10%, it reveals this massive internal struggle.
The depreciation metrics are brutal.
They really are.
Yeah.
Fixed capital consumption, which is the literal wear and tear on their infrastructure, the aging bridges, the depreciating manufacturing equipment, it is actively eating up 15 to 17% of their GNI.
Just a constant drain.
And on top of that, there's a quantified deduction for CO2 damage.
And this is where the methodology gets truly fascinating to me. The fact that the World Bank aggregates are actively quantifying CO2 damage as a direct subtraction from national wealth.
It's a huge shift in thinking.
Massive. It shows an evolution in how we understand economic sustainability. For decades, carbon emissions were just an economic externality.
You polluted, and the cost was just dispersed into the atmosphere.
It's exactly. Completely untethered from your national ledger. Nobody paid for it on paper. Now that thermodynamic debt is being mathematically priced into their actual wealth accumulation.
So the Eurozone is generating immense wealth, yes, but they're fighting this constant grinding battle against the decay of their physical assets and the ecological penalty of their own industrialization.
Right. Every step forward comes with a structural drag.
But wait, let me push back on this a bit. If they are constantly upgrading their technology and moving toward a high-tech service economy, why is fixed capital consumption still eroding 15 to 17% of their income?
It seems counterintuitive, right?
Yeah. Shouldn't advanced digitized assets be getting more efficient and therefore depreciating slower than, I don't know, old 1970s steel mills?
So you're instinctively equating depreciation with physical wear and tear, the rusting gears, the crumbling concrete.
Right.
But in a highly advanced digitized economy, depreciation is driven by technological obsolescence.
Oh, wow.
Think about it. A massive server farm or a semiconductor fabrication plant might not physically rust away in 5 years, but its technological relevance completely evaporates.
Because the next generation of microchips is already out.
Exactly. The capital expenditure required to constantly replace outpaced technology in a knowledge economy is immense. That 15 to 17% drag isn't just rotting bridges, it's the punishing cost of staying on the bleeding edge of global innovation.
It's the Red Queen hypothesis in economics. You have to run as fast as you can just to stay in the exact same place.
That's a perfect way to frame it.
So if obsolescence and environmental damage are dragging their wealth down that aggressively, how are they maintaining that 10% positive net savings? The data points to a very specific offset, right?
Yes, education expenditure. It adds roughly 4.5% back into the net savings calculation.
It's a profound structural hedge. The data essentially proves mathematically that the Eurozone's primary defense mechanism against physical depreciation is human capital accumulation.
They are aggressively investing in the neurological capacity of their citizens. They have to outpace the decay of their physical infrastructure.
It's like by pouring capital into education, they're creating a workforce capable of generating higher margin, intangible value.
Right, things like software, pharmaceuticals, advanced engineering patents.
Stuff that doesn't physically rust.
Exactly. They are essentially outlearning their own depreciation.
For you listening, this dynamic is exactly why redefining wealth is so critical to understanding the future. If a society only optimizes for gross output, it's just going to blindly build and consume until it suffocates on its own exhaust.
The 20th century trap.
Right. The Eurozone's long-term data proves that true sustainable wealth accumulation relies heavily on treating human cognition as the ultimate appreciating asset. But that realization leads us directly into a massive structural collision. Because while they have mastered the art of generating high-margin wealth, the very human foundation required to generate that wealth is fundamentally fracturing.
The demographic indicators in this dataset outline what is arguably the most severe structural bottleneck in modern economic history.
The age dependency ratios. It's the most alarming chart in the entire stack.
It's the boss fight of the Eurozone economy.
Truly, when you look at the total age dependency ratio, it hit nearly 50% in 2023. But the truly chilling metric, the one that fundamentally alters the macroeconomic reality of the continent, is the old age dependency ratio.
The speed of this shift is what's so jarring.
In 1960, it sat at a highly manageable 15.6%.
Yeah.
By 2023, it had more than doubled, rocketing to 35.4%.
And at the same time, the base of the pyramid is vanishing.
Right. We're looking at a society where the youth bracket, those aged 0 to 14, has collapsed from 25.1% of the population down to just 15%.
Let's translate that abstract percentage into the tangible reality of the labor market for a second.
Please?
A 35.4% old age dependency ratio means there are now roughly just 3 working-age individuals to support every 1 person of retirement age.
3 to 1.
3 to 1. And falling.
And that ratio is entirely dictated by a profound triumph in public health that has, bizarrely, inadvertently created an economic nightmare.
The medical success is undeniable.
The data on life expectancy is a testament to human ingenuity. Female life expectancy jumped from 72.1 years in 1960 to over 84 years recently. Male life expectancy rose from 66.6 to over 79 years.
And the survival rates to age 65 are staggering.
Yeah, 93.2% for women, 81.2% for men.
But the demographic pyramid that dictated 20th century economic policy has completely inverted.
Right, because every universal healthcare system, every state pension scheme, every broad social security net in the Eurozone, they were all conceptualized and funded in an era when you had this massive broad base of young, healthy workers.
Contributing tax revenue to support a very, very narrow tip of elderly citizens.
The actuarial math of the 1960s basically assumed people would retire at 65 and perhaps draw from the system for, 5 to 7 years?
Exactly. But now they are surviving for 2, sometimes 3 decades post-retirement.
And the nature of their survival has completely changed. The data clearly shows that non-communicable diseases, NCDs, now account for an overwhelming 90% of deaths.
Epidemiologists often refer to the dominance of NCDs, things like cardiovascular diseases, advanced cancers, Alzheimer's, chronic respiratory issues, as a luxury problem.
It sounds incredibly callous.
It does, but from a macro perspective, it means the Eurozone has successfully eradicated the infectious diseases and occupational hazards that used to kill people in their 20s and 30s.
So they're surviving long enough for their cellular biology to simply degrade.
Exactly. They've conquered the acute killers, leaving only the chronic ones.
But the economic friction of that biological degradation is immense. I mean, treating a severe bacterial infection in 1965 required a course of antibiotics and maybe a short hospital stay.
Relatively cheap, economically speaking.
Right. But managing a chronic non-communicable disease like diabetes or Alzheimer's, that requires decades of highly specialized, incredibly expensive, continuous medical intervention.
So those 3 young workers aren't just supporting a retiree who is sitting quietly on a porch reading the paper.
No. They are funding a multi-decade high-tech medical intervention for an ever-expanding cohort of the elderly.
You've isolated the exact fiscal paradox there. The Eurozone is being economically punished for doing the right thing medically.
It's tragic, in a way.
It is. The financial burden per capita for the elderly cohort is rising exponentially precisely because the medical technology keeping them alive has become so advanced and resource-intensive.
So what does this all mean moving forward?
Well, if that dependency ratio slips from 3 to 1 down to 2 to 1, the tax extraction required from the working-age population will become completely unsustainable.
You risk massive capital flight and generational resentment.
Yeah.
I mean, you cannot ask a 28-year-old engineer to surrender half their income solely to maintain the chronic care infrastructure of a generation that outnumbers them.
You can't. They'll just leave. They'll take their human capital to a demographic environment that doesn't tax them into oblivion.
So put yourself in the shoes of the central planners,
Mm-hmm.
finance ministers, the societal architects of the Eurozone. You see this demographic tidal wave approaching in the 90s and 2000s. How do you respond?
Your options are very limited.
Right. You can't force a sudden baby boom. You can't politically afford to dismantle the welfare state. That's electoral suicide.
The only viable mathematical solution is to take the shrinking pool of workers you do have and engineer them to be exponentially more productive.
You have to extract vastly more economic value out of every single human hour worked.
which perfectly explains the immense, deliberate structural shifts we see in the labor and education data in the next segment.
The Eurozone recognized they were losing the sheer volume game, so they pivoted entirely to an optimization game.
And the first, most critical lever they pulled to offset the demographic collapse was the aggressive integration of women into the formal labor force.
The numbers on that are definitive. Female labor participation for ages 15 to 64 surged from 53.2% in 1990 to 69.2% by 2023.
That is a massive leap.
It isn't just a gradual statistical creep. That is a fundamental reorganization of the European family unit and labor market in just over 3 decades.
It was an absolute necessity. I mean, if female labor participation had remained stagnant at 1990 levels, the old age dependency crisis would have already crippled the Eurozone economy.
They were starving for productivity.
And the formal integration of women provided a massive, relatively untapped reservoir of human capital. But achieving a 16 percentage point jump required profound structural engineering.
It isn't just a cultural shift.
No, it required overhauling tax codes that previously penalized dual-income households. It demanded massive state investments in early childhood education and subsidized childcare infrastructure.
So women weren't forced to choose between maternal duties and career progression.
Exactly. You had to socialize the cost of childcare.
And you see that exact childcare infrastructure reflected in the pre-primary enrollment data. It jumped from 67.9% in 1970 to over 101% recently.
And for anyone wondering how a metric exceeds 100%.
Yeah, the data knows this is gross enrollment, which captures early and late enrollments outside the strict age bracket. But the point is, they effectively institutionalized early childhood development,
Which simultaneously freed up female labor and began the cognitive training of the next generation even earlier.
It's a brilliant dual-purpose policy.
Exactly. But simply expanding the labor pool wasn't enough. A larger workforce doing, low-value, low-margin tasks wouldn't generate the immense tax revenue needed to support the aging population,
They needed those workers to operate at the absolute apex of the global value chain.
which drove the transition from what the report categorizes as equilibrium to excellence in their education system.
The sheer volume of resources poured into the individual student is staggering. Look at the primary schools. The pupil-to-teacher ratio was optimized from 22 students per teacher down to just 13 to 1.
That is incredibly expensive to maintain.
Very. They tightened the ratio to provide incredibly dense, personalized instruction. And then, the tertiary education numbers, the university enrollment, skyrocketed from 53.4% in 2000s to nearly 82% by 2022.
An 82% tertiary enrollment rate is the hallmark of a society that has completely abandoned the mid-20th century industrial model.
They traded quantity for quality.
Exactly. They aren't training people to operate heavy machinery or perform repetitive assembly line tasks. They are mass-producing, highly specialized, credentialed knowledge workers. They are cultivating cognitive density.
It's like an arms race of the mind. Since they can't outpopulate the rest of the world, they decided to outeducate them. But looking closely at this mass production of knowledge workers, there's a serious underlying vulnerability.
The gender disparity at the top end.
Right. The data highlights a gender parity index, or GPI, in higher education of 1.2. That indicates women are vastly outperforming and out-enrolling men at the university level.
It's a consistent trend across high-income economies.
Now, we already see in the charts that unemployment for individuals with only basic education is significantly higher than for those with tertiary degrees. If the modern economy demands advanced credentials, and men are falling behind in acquiring those credentials, aren't we engineering a massive social fracture?
It is a critical sociological vulnerability. The transition to a knowledge-based, service-heavy economy heavily favors the soft skills, academic endurance, and communicative competencies that the current educational framework cultivates.
Areas where female students are currently thriving.
Yes. Conversely, the traditional physical labor and manufacturing sectors that historically absorbed uncredentialed young men have been either automated or offshored.
Which perfectly explains the fluctuations in the youth NEET rates we see marked here, those not in education, employment, or training.
Precisely. If a substantial cohort of young men fails to adapt to this highly credentialed, service-oriented environment, they become economically stranded.
They aren't generating the high-margin tax revenue required to support the demographic burden.
And worse, they transform into an economic drag themselves, requiring state intervention and social support.
It's a very fragile equilibrium. The Eurozone has optimized its workforce for high-end cognitive labor, But anyone who falls off that narrow, highly educated path has very few viable economic alternatives.
The safety net for the uncredentialed is shrinking rapidly.
So if we zoom out and visualize this modern Eurozone workforce, we are no longer looking at an army of blue-collar workers on a factory floor.
Not at all.
We are looking at a highly credentialed, increasingly female workforce operating in specialized tech hubs, advanced pharmaceutical labs, and elite logistics centers. They are the cognitive engine.
That's the organism today.
But what exactly is this engine producing that generates enough wealth to keep the whole system afloat?
They are designing, engineering, and exporting the complex components that the rest of the global economy relies on.
Which brings us to the global connectivity data. And it is remarkable. Merchandise exports as a percentage of GDP didn't just grow. They leaped from 26.3% in the 1960s to nearly 72.5% by 2022.
Think about the scale of that.
I am. Nearly three-quarters of their entire gross domestic product is tied directly to the exchange of physical goods across borders. That is an astonishing level of outward orientation.
The Eurozone is not a closed fortress. It is a hyper-connected web.
And they aren't exporting raw timber or crude oil. The data shows that high-tech exports consistently maintain a solid 20% share of their manufactured exports.
That's where the margin is.
Furthermore, their cognitive output, measured by scientific and technical journal publications, more than doubled from roughly 220,000 in 1996 to over 485,000 by 2020.
And the density of R&D personnel per million people is continuously climbing alongside it.
This is the direct dividend of that immense educational investment we just discussed, isn't it?
100%. The 13-to-1 teacher ratio, the 82% university enrollment, it all funnels directly into those 485,000 scientific papers and that 20% high-tech export share.
They're monetizing their brains.
Exactly. The Eurozone has positioned itself as a premier cognitive node in the global economy. Furthermore, the data indicates that over 10% of their imports come from other high-income economies.
Meaning they aren't just importing cheap raw materials from developing nations to process and sell. They are deeply integrated into highly complex, synergistic, regional supply chains.
They are buying advanced components from each other, adding specialized value, and re-exporting.
It's a web of high-value interdependency. But this level of integration has to be a double-edged sword.
Oh, without a doubt.
And that's exactly what I want to interrogate. If 72.5% of your economic output relies on global trade, aren't you essentially surrendering your economic sovereignty to the whims of the global market?
You're definitely exposing your flanks.
Right. If a major shipping lane is blocked, or if geopolitical tensions cause a fracturing of global trade agreements, doesn't the Eurozone catch a massive, debilitating economic cold? I mean, we saw the brutal supply chain contagions during 2020. Isn't this hyperconnectivity an existential risk?
The vulnerability is absolutely real, and the data reflects it. The severe contractions in their adjusted net income during the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 pandemic demonstrate the immediate exposure of an export-heavy model.
It craters when the world stops buying.
When global demand seizes up, the Eurozone feels the deceleration instantly. However, their defense mechanism against this vulnerability is the concept of indispensability.
Indispensability, meaning they make things the rest of the world can't easily substitute.
Precisely. If your primary export is unrefined copper, you are entirely at the mercy of global commodity fluctuations.
Because anyone can dig up copper.
Right. If demand drops or a cheaper supplier emerges, you are easily replaced. But the Eurozone exports elite, highly specialized capital goods. We're talking advanced medical imaging machines, precision optics for semiconductor manufacturing, specialized aerospace components.
For really hard stuff.
Exactly. If you are a developing nation trying to build a modern hospital or upgrade your telecommunications grid, you cannot simply source those components from a cheaper, low-skill vendor.
You have to buy European.
You do. The Eurozone has embedded itself so deeply into the complex layers of global manufacturing that they are extremely difficult to bypass. They aren't just a passive market, they're an indispensable node.
And they've built the physical infrastructure to ensure that complex exchange is as frictionless as possible. Look at the Logistics Performance Index, the LPI. It scores their tracking, tracing, and customs efficiency between an elite 3.5 and 4.0 out of 5.
Which is top tier globally.
You see long-term, sustained growth in container port throughput. They are actively optimizing the physical arteries of global trade. Meanwhile, Metrics like fixed telephone subscriptions have completely plummeted.
Which just indicates a rapid shedding of obsolete technology in favor of modern digital communication networks.
For you listening, this dynamic highlights a profound reality of the 21st century economy. Security no longer comes from isolation or self-sufficiency. It comes from making yourself an indispensable, highly efficient node in the global network.
That's the only way to survive. But, and this is the major pivot, operating that node powering the massive container ports, running the massive server farms for digital logistics, firing up the advanced semiconductor foundries.
It requires an absolutely immense baseline of energy.
A staggering amount of energy.
And here we hit the grand thermodynamic constraint. You have a society desperate to grow its high-tech GDP to pay for its aging population. But we know that historically, explosive industrial growth comes with explosive environmental degradation.
The two were always linked.
Right. So how is the Eurozone managing this massive energy demand without accelerating that CO2 damage penalty that we saw eroding their wealth back in the first data set?
This brings us to the mechanics of their green transition.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
For over a century, macroeconomic theory operated under a relatively unshakable assumption. Economic expansion required a proportional expansion in carbon emissions.
To generate more wealth, you simply had to burn more dense carbon-heavy fuel, coal, oil, gas.
Exactly. But the data mapping the Eurozone's energy mix and environmental performance completely shatters that assumed law. The reliance on fossil fuels dropped significantly, from 80.2% in the 1970s down to 66.6% by 2015.
And simultaneously, there's an explosive, almost vertical growth curve in non-hydro renewable energy. Wind and solar are just booming.
The expansion of renewables is vital, but the true engineering feat of the Eurozone's energy grid lies in its stabilization.
Yeah, let's look at the nuclear data here. The charts highlight that nuclear energy has been held remarkably steady, providing roughly 35% of their total energy mix.
And that stability is the secret ingredient.
Why is maintaining that 35% nuclear baseline so critical, though? I mean, why not push for 100% renewables if the ultimate goal is decarbonization?
Because of the fundamental nature of electricity grids, modern, high-tech manufacturing, the precision optics, the pharmaceutical labs we talked about, requires power that operates within incredibly tight frequency tolerances.
It can't flicker.
It cannot flicker. It requires what we call baseload power. That's massive, uninterruptible, dispatchable electricity that does not care if the sun goes behind a cloud or if the wind stops blowing across the North Sea.
Because wind and solar, while great, are highly effective at generating clean volume, but they are inherently intermittent.
They lack the thermodynamic inertia to anchor a continent-sized grid.
Ah, thermodynamic inertia. I like that. So by maintaining nuclear power at a robust 35%, the Eurozone secured a massive zero-carbon anchor.
Exactly. That nuclear baseload provides the stable grid frequency required to aggressively experiment with and integrate those volatile renewable sources.
Without that steady 35%, the explosive growth in wind and solar would risk destabilizing the grid. And that would paralyze the very high-tech manufacturing sector they rely on for exports.
It would be economic suicide.
And the macroeconomic result of this carefully engineered energy mix is what the World Bank data calls decoupling.
Decoupling is the holy grail of modern economics.
The Eurozone has achieved a massive reduction in their GDP carbon intensity. The amount of CO2 emitted to generate one constant dollar of GDP plummeted from 0.55 kilograms down to under 0.35 kilograms.
And it's not just relative efficiency. Their absolute total greenhouse gas emissions have shown a definitive, continuous downward trajectory since 1990.
They aren't just curbing carbon, they're successfully reducing potent secondary gases like methane and nitrous oxide too.
The data proves that decoupling is practically achievable at scale. They are expanding their wealth generation while simultaneously shrinking their thermodynamic footprint.
It's like realizing you don't need to eat junk food to bulk up at the gym. They are building economic muscle while actually trimming the carbon fat.
That's a great analogy.
And the beauty of this is how perfectly it loops back to our very first observation about adjusted net national income.
The reduction in the CO2 damage penalty.
Precisely. If we recall, the World Bank subtracts carbon damage directly from their accumulated wealth. As their carbon intensity drops from 0.55 to 0.35 kilograms per dollar, that mathematical penalty shrinks.
They keep more of what they make.
They are quite literally retaining a higher percentage of the wealth they generate because they are no longer forced to spend it mitigating the ecological destruction of their own success.
It is an incredibly powerful, self-reinforcing, virtuous cycle.
Let's trace that cycle. High educational investment leads to advanced technological innovation,
Which drives down carbon intensity,
which retains more national wealth.
which can then be reinvested back into the educational baseline. It is the ultimate manifestation of moving from an economy of extraction to an economy of efficiency.
So as we synthesize this massive 60-year medical chart of the Eurozone, the evolutionary trajectory is remarkably clear.
They have successfully transitioned from a post-war, resource-heavy, labor-intensive industrial model.
Into a highly educated, deeply connected, environmentally efficient knowledge economy. The organism has survived and adapted beautifully.
But what is the ultimate prognosis?
Right. The structural data indicates a highly resilient organism, but one facing an inescapable biological reality.
The aging.
The success of their green transition and their human capital optimization provides them with an immense buffer, but deep population aging remains the overarching existential threat. The sheer demographic gravity of a society where a third of the population is elderly will constantly strain their fiscal architecture.
The structural prescription moving forward is incredibly tight. They cannot afford inefficiency.
They must continue to aggressively align their higher education output with the absolute highest-end demands of the global labor market. A highly educated worker who isn't producing top-tier exportable value is a luxury the Eurozone can no longer afford.
And they must push the decarbonization and technological efficiency of their infrastructure even further. They have to mathematically offset the massive capital drain of their healthcare and pension obligations.
Their past was defined by building raw volume. Their future survival depends entirely on achieving ruthless systemic efficiency.
The transition is far from over.
Looking at this data, the conventional narrative is that the Eurozone is in a state of managed decline. You hear it all the time, an old world museum slowly collapsing under the weight of its own elderly population. It is consistently framed as a demographic tragedy.
That's the standard headline, yeah.
But for you listening, I want to leave you with a completely different framework to view this data. What if this massive demographic contraction isn't a crisis?
What do you mean?
What if it is a remarkably well-timed evolutionary defense mechanism?
Oh, you're talking about the intersection of demographics and automation.
Exactly. Think about the fundamental trajectory of the global economy over the next 2 decades. We are standing on the precipice of advanced artificial intelligence, deep machine learning, and widespread robotic automation.
Technology is designed specifically to eliminate massive swaths of routine, mid-level cognitive and physical labor.
If you are a nation with a booming, massive population of young, averagely skilled workers, the arrival of AI isn't an economic boom. It is a recipe for catastrophic technological unemployment and immense social instability.
What do you do with millions of young workers when algorithms can do their jobs infinitely faster and cheaper?
But the Eurozone avoids that specific collision.
Because they don't have the youth bulge anymore.
Precisely. Their labor force is naturally shrinking at the exact historical moment that human labor is becoming technologically redundant.
That's a fascinating way to look at it.
They don't have an excess of young workers fighting for disappearing jobs. They have a tight, highly educated cohort whose primary function will be directing and managing automated systems, rather than acting as the cogs themselves.
So if human capital transitions from executing tasks to orchestrating artificial intelligence,
Then a smaller, hyper-educated population embedded in a hyper-efficient green energy grid might not be a symptom of decline.
it might be the exact blueprint for survival in the late 21st century.
It completely flips the diagnosis.
Yeah.
We started this journey looking at an aging patient and assumed we were documenting their twilight. But the data suggests we might actually be documenting their metamorphosis into something entirely new.
A post-labor economy.
Exactly. What if the Eurozone isn't dying? What if it's just the first to evolve into the post-labor economy? It just proves that true, actionable insight doesn't come from panicking over a single data point or a single news cycle.
It comes from zooming out.
Zooming out, understanding the deep historical context, and examining how all these intricate systems interconnect over time. Keep interrogating the data, and keep questioning the conventional narratives. We'll see you on the next deep dive.